Welcome. I'm Colonel Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to see everybody here. Great to have you here. Come on in, you're good. Yeah. Before we launch into tonight's program, a couple of recognitions for folks, whether they're here in person or watching at home. I'd like to acknowledge any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors. And if we don't have them in the audience, let's give those in the virtual audience a round of applause. Next, we'd like to acknowledge any veterans or active duty service members of our armed forces from any era. Would you please stand or wave and be recognized as well? Thank you for your service. And also, none of that is possible without the families that support them. And so family members of any veterans of active duty, would you also stand or wave and be recognized as well? So thank you for that. Speaking of veterans, it's great to see General and Mrs. Dave Mize of the Mayor's Military Advisory Council here. Great to see you guys. Thanks for supporting. I'd also like to recognize our Patriot Circle and charter members here tonight. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring many of these programs such as this to you and really to reach the folks we do. I want to thank in particular Robert and Kiki Pretty. Thanks for all your continued support in that line. Now tonight we're also honored to have our Department of Veterans Affairs and Bastion partners over there. Hope you've had a chance to engage with them. You know, it's an opportunity for us to get our word out, but also to get their important word out as well. So thank you for coming this evening. It's great to have you here. Now, many of you know, we finished up in September with end of war content, celebrating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. As we completed that commemoration and programming on the end of war, now we're just a few weeks away from Veterans Day. Tonight's program is really cast in that light, a good reminder, although the official surrenders of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan took place in May and September 1945, the war did not automatically end in 1945 for those who waged it. And for many, the war would continue on for the remainder of their lives. So tonight we're honored to have a distinguished author, professor, historian, to share his latest book, The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II. Now, Dr. David Nasaw is historian, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, best-selling author of The Last Million. Now, The Last Million was named the best book of the year by NPR, Kirkus Reviews, and History Today. And according to The Economist, it's, quote, one of the 6 must-read books on the Second World War. So, you know, if you haven't read that one yet. Now, in addition, David's also the author of The Patriarch, The Remarkable Life and Turbulent Times of Joseph P. Kennedy, which was a New York Times 5 Best Nonfiction Book of the Year. Pretty incredible. Andrew Carnegie, New York Times Notable Book of the Year and winner of the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize. And The Chief, about William Randolph Hearst, which was the winner of the Bancroft Prize. So just to go through his prizes, we'd be here a long time tonight. Dr. Nasaw is the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History Emeritus at the Graduate School and University Center of the City University of New York, and the past president of the Society of American Historians. Now, in 2023, Dr. Nasaw was honored by the New York Public Library as the Library Lion. It's kind of a cool name, Library Lion. I had the pleasure of touring with David today and walking around the galleries. I know you're in for a really amazing, engaging, and important discussion that'll change how you think about the World War II generation. Now, leading that discussion tonight is the Jenny Craig Institute senior historian, Dr. Bradley Hart. Bradley received his PhD in history at Churchill College in Cambridge He's the author of 2 books, including Hitler's American Friends, The Third Reich Supporters in the United States, which was recipient of the 2019 German Studies Association Sybil Halpern Milton Memorial Book Prize. Now, before joining us, Bradley taught at the California State University in Fresno. He worked on Capitol Hill as an International Affairs Fellow, but I should note he's also the host of the museum's most recent podcast, Secret World War II, Spies and Special Ops. So check that out. I think you're going to enjoy that too. But ladies and gentlemen, to discuss the Wounded Generation, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Bradley Hart, Dr. David Nasaw. Gentlemen, audience, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bell, for that very kind introduction. And David Nasaw, what a pleasure it is and an honor to have you here. It's truly a remarkable book. I've had the pleasure of reading every page of it at least once. And it truly does change the way that you think about World War II in very fundamental ways. But before I start talking about the content of the book and some of the themes that come out, I want to ask you, we just heard your remarkable resume in terms of your past work, biographies of no less eminent figures than William Randolph Hearst, Joseph P. Kennedy, Andrew Carnegie, and then, of course, your most recent book on the millions of displaced persons after the war. Why this project and why now?
2 reasons. One, when I did the book on the last million, the refugees from Eastern Europe who had no homes to return to and spent 2, 3, 4 years in displaced persons camps behind barbed wire, it became crystal clear to me, something I should have known as a historian, that wars do not end with peace treaties. They do not end when the soldiers go home and take off their uniforms. They do not end when the hostilities end. They didn't for the refugees. And then I began to think about the American veterans. And I thought about my father. And this is, a little bit weird, but, stay with me. My father came home from Eritrea, where he ran and dismantled a hospital after the Americans went from North Africa to Sicily and then to Italy. And he was older, and he was a lawyer, and he didn't type, and he didn't take stenography, and he spent the first years of the war, the first 6 months of the war, as a driver for Colonel Howard Hutter. And Colonel Hutter said, Josh, my father's name, I'm on my way to North Africa, and this is ridiculous that you are driving people around. It's a waste of your talents, and you don't want to spend, tell your children that you were a driver during World War II. He sent my father to officers candidate school in South Carolina, a long way from the Lower East Side in Brooklyn, where my father had grown up. And the next thing he knew, he was on his way to Eritrea. That much of the story I know. Something happened in Eritrea. And he came home with a full medical discharge, with a heart condition, an alcoholic, smoking 3 to 4 packs of Lucky Strikes a day. He stopped drinking because my mother said that she was leaving with me and my brother if he didn't stop. So he stopped drinking, but he never stopped smoking. And he died at age 61. I tried to find out as a kid and as a young man. I would ask the questions, what happened? All I had was a little picture of him with some strange-looking dog with huge ears. That was the only memo, the only remembrance of Eritrea. And like 95% of the children of veterans who I talked to, my father didn't tell me what went on. And I would try, and it quickly became clear that he didn't want to talk about it. So as a historian, I couldn't find out what happened to him. His records were destroyed in a fire. So I did a study of his generation to put him in context. So this book is, in a sense, it's a tribute to my father to try to find out what these veterans went through, to try to find out why my father came home an alcoholic, addicted to nicotine. He pulled himself together, stopped drinking, was a successful lawyer, but he never had a full night's sleep without pills to put him to sleep, and put him to sleep in such a way that he needed more pills to wake up in the morning. Long answer to a short question.
No, it's a remarkable profile, as you just indicated, of an entire generation. And I want to unpack something that you just alluded to, which is the physical and mental scars that you talk about in really the first chapter of the book. And a couple of numbers that I, even as someone who studies this period, found fairly amazing. But you say in 1943, more than 1 million men were sent home from the armed forces, half of them with disability discharges, which is really remarkable when you think about the size of that number. In the last year of the war, 550,000 Americans are killed or wounded. So we often think that the war kind of tails off in the last 12 months. It does not. In fact, this is the highest period of bloodshed of the conflict. But you also talk about, both physical wounds and what's referred to as neuropsychiatric defects, quote. And we have a different term that develops in the later period. But tell us a bit about the mental toll that these young men go through and what they experience when they come back from this period of extraordinary violence.
In the Great War, World War I, the Army discovered that there were many GIs who went abroad who they referred to as ineffective. They had to be pulled off the front lines. So in World War II, they brought in, I don't want to make any disparaging remarks about psychiatrists, they brought in a whole contingent of psychiatrists. And the psychiatrist's job, when you went to be examined to see if you were going to be drafted or not, there was a psychiatrist, and he asked you, 2 or 3 questions and passed you along. But the commanders in the field had been told that this is not World War I. Everybody who's here, nobody's going to break down. They're all sane, they're together, they're not going to have any psychological problems. At Guadalcanal, the number of First Marines and then GIs who, quote, broke down and were sent to Guam, I think was the nearest general hospital, was extraordinary. And it quickly became clear that the stress of war, the stress of being what the soldiers, the servicemen called expendable, was such that those who survived without physical wounds, they couldn't go on. And the Army and the Marines tried to patch them up and put them back together again. They referred to what was going on as combat fatigue. Well, if it's called combat fatigue, how do you cure fatigue? With rest. So they were put on a rest relaxation regimen in Guam. They were sent back, and within a couple of weeks, they were back at Guam and then sent home. And this was the case all through the Pacific and in the Italian front, in Europe. You go through this museum, and we were talking about this earlier. You go through this museum, and you look at the exhibits, Guadalcanal exhibit, the Battle of the Bulge exhibit. You look at any number of them. And you see what these guys are going through. And you think to yourself, how could anyone have come home in one piece physically without mental wounds, without psychic wounds? And they did. They did. In every war, there have been people who were referred to as shell-shocked. There are any number of names. It was not until the middle 80s that a diagnosis was given to this disorder, PTSD.
And one other thing I learned from your book, 1944, there are so many wounded coming back to the United States that the military actually begins converting passenger trains into trains for the wounded. They remove the seats and make space for the wounded to be transported across the United States. And it raised the question for me of this is possibly a unique experience in American history. Perhaps only the Civil War would have been a time you would have had so many wounded being transported domestically. How is the public perceiving this? Is the public aware of what's happening or what's being presented to the American public in this period?
The historians have gotten it wrong. Don't quote me on this. These are my people. But the common understanding was that censorship during World War II was heavy-handed. And it's true that every letter that every serviceman and woman wrote was looked over by an officer before it was sent off. That much is true. But it's also true that Secretary of War Stimson and President Roosevelt knew that the greatest danger to the United States was that the American people would grow angry, anxious that the war was not over, that the war went on and on and on. And in order to tell the American people, to let them know what our guys were going through, they let the newspaper reporters from Guadalcanal on, the radio commentators, the newsreel people. It wasn't until late 1943 that any dead servicemen were shown. But the reports to the home front, and then the return of the wounded, and it was hard. In every community, someone knew someone who had come home early. And the most difficulties were the guys who came back with what were called psychoneurotic problems. The guys who came back without physical wounds or imperfections, but unable to focus, given to sudden rages, with nightmares and flashbacks and alternating states of hyperactivity and depression, and unable to relate to their children. And they began coming back in 1943 through 1944 through 1945 through the end of the war. And the number who came back were only a minority of those who suffered what would later be called PTSD. The author, J.D. Salinger, who was a counterintelligence officer and was able to disguise his PTSD by visiting it on his fictional characters in his short stories, one of whom in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which if you haven't read is, you know this?
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary story. This veteran commits suicide. Salinger, on VE Day, he's in Germany, he loads a pistol, he takes it and he aims it at his hand, and then he puts it down after thinking, well, how am I going to write with one hand? You know, and then he commits himself to a hospital. He doesn't go to a military hospital because he doesn't want to be labeled a psycho. He goes to another hospital, and he writes Hemingway who he had met briefly. Every young author tried to meet Hemingway, who did nothing during the war except he hung out in Paris.
Liberated the Ritz bar, as I recall, at least by his own account, yes.
Yeah. So Salinger had met Hemingway, so Salinger writes Hemingway, and he says, I'm here. He said, I'm in a hospital. He said, but I'm not a psycho. I don't want anybody to, I just need somebody to talk to. He came home, and his relatives thought, his children thought, that he had PTSD, very severe case. But he didn't want to be labeled a psycho.
Let's talk about veterans returning to the home front. As you just said, this begins even before the end of the war, of course. And there's a variety of social consequences that you highlight really effectively in the book. You've already referred to alcohol abuse among veterans, of chain smoking. But surprising to me was divorce. Yeah. There's a huge number of divorces after the war, which is heartbreaking when you really think about that aspect. Take us through what American family life looks like post-war.
In 1946, there were more divorces. The divorce rate was greater than it had ever been, and it would not reach those levels again until the 1960s, briefly. In 1946, divorce is frowned upon. In the 1960s, it's more accepted. But the divorce rate was through the roof. And it was through the roof for many, many, many reasons. The guys had been away, we forget this as well. In World War I, the average time in uniform was less than a year. In World War II, it's almost 3 years. In World War I, the people who go abroad are abroad for 6 months. In World War II, 3/4 of the servicemen end up abroad, and they end up abroad for an average of a year and a half. A lot of them for 2 years and 3 years. So they come back entirely different. Bill Malden, the cartoonist, says, these are not the clean-cut boys who went abroad. They're different, and don't forget it. But we also must not forget that the war wives and the girlfriends were different. The war wives had gone, I don't know the exact number, 7-8 million, I think, worked in war plants and munitions plants. And they took over the family. They repaired the sink. They got the car fixed. They paid the rent. They looked after the bank accounts. They looked after the kids. They took care of the house, okay? And they're prepared by the women's magazines. Be careful, the guy's going to come home. Well, the guy came home, and he didn't know what to do. He wanted to pay the rent. He wanted to fix the roof. And he wanted his wife to stop working. The clash was remarkable. The women on the home front had been told again and again and again and again, we in the military medical corps can do only so much for these men, but it's going to be your burden. You've got to nurse them, not coddle them, but help them readjust. And if they don't readjust, if they drink too much, if they're angry, it's your fault. The tensions were unbelievable. And it was not that the guys didn't want to be married. What's remarkable about this period is in 1946, there are more divorces than ever before, and there are more marriages than ever before. There's another, just one other point. The women at home had watched the newsreels, had read the newspapers, and had perused Life magazine and Look and Saturday Evening Post in the last year of the war. And they had seen GIs as they enter Rome, as they enter Paris, being hugged and grabbed and kissed. and lining up at brothels. This is in Life magazine. And the women knew that the guys had affairs, short, long, and they were told, forget about it. The men had the Dear John letters invented during this period because the women were under surveillance. They were under surveillance by their mother-in-laws, by any number of people who would write through the Red Cross the soldiers and would say, I don't, I feel uneasy about telling you, but, your wife has been staying out late at night. And then the Dear John letter arises. So both sides, and some of it is true. Young women didn't turn into nuns overnight because their guys were away. So the sense of betrayal, of sexual betrayal on both ends is impossible to cure. And that adds to the divorce rates as well. There are other signs that we don't pay attention to. The figures for lynching are higher in 1946 than they had been during the war and in the preceding years. There's a photograph in Life magazine of Paris, the GIs in Paris, and one of the photographs is of a black GI dancing with a white woman, and they're having a great time. Well, when that photograph gets back to the South, to the politicians there, they begin to prepare. And how do you stop what they fear is going to be an assault on Jim Crow? Well, with violence. And one of the ironies is that, there was a suit shortage and a white shirt shortage when the guys came back. Richard Nixon runs for Congress, and he thinks successful because he has wealthy donors who buy him suits of clothes so he doesn't have to wear his uniform. Orville Forbes, who's later the governor of Arkansas, has to campaign in his uniform, and it offends the civilians, and he loses. The black soldiers, who come 2/3 of them from the South, they return to the South. They can't afford new suits of clothes. They wear their uniforms, and that is a direct affront to the supporters of Jim Crow. And the numbers of lynchings, the violence, the arrests go through the roof. There's I guess in the Liberation Pavilion, there's a extraordinary photograph, I saw it today for the first time, of 4 women marching in front of the White House, begging Truman, holding up, not begging because they're proud, women, holding up signs, stop lynching now. They want Truman to push Congress to have it pass an anti-lynching law.
To which there's a great deal of resistance.
Doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen.
I wanted to ask about something related to race relations after the war, and that is actually housing. So I found this remarkable in your book because we sort of, I think, consciously know that the Second World War changed the physical landscape of the United States because of the growth of the suburbs. But take us through what these veterans are facing in terms of housing and how race relations plays into that sort of discussion and debate as well.
Yeah. As a historian, one of the things we try to do is to put things in context, okay? And the context for the World War II and the return of the veterans of the World War II is the Depression. All of these guys and their families had lived the previous decade in depression. The unemployment rate was close to 20% in 1938. In 1940, it was 15%, okay? And the home front, the politicians, are worried that when these guys come back, right? When these guys come back, it is possible that they're going to do what the veterans of World War I in Italy and Germany did. They were the backbone of the fascist and the Nazi movements. Okay. The greatest difficulty, and the newspapers and the magazines and feature films are filled with this. There had been no housing built during the Depression. There had been no housing built during the war. Okay. The housing, the old housing that had been built up to 1930, 31 had deteriorated without repairs. There is a housing shortage in this country unlike anything we've ever seen. And the veterans come back, and for those with families, they end up moving in with their in-laws, which must not have been very fun, or moving into tent cities, or moving into barracks, or moving into substandard housing. There's a extraordinarily bad movie called Divorce with Kay Francis, who was already, a little bit. She played someone who was 20 years younger, and she's a femme fatale. And she hears that her former boyfriend had come back from the war, and she moves to ensnare him. And before it happens, in the prologue to the film, which is called Divorce, a judge says that the divorce rates are high because of the homeless rates, that families that can't live together are more likely to divorce. In a lot of cases, the guy moves out, gets an apartment, while the kids stay with the in-laws. The problems with, some of the problems you can't turn a switch and turn a war economy into a civilian economy. You can't turn soldiers into civilians by snapping your fingers. And the GI Bill is written for two reasons. Number one, to reward the veterans. In every war, Americans, we've rewarded the veterans. We've given them land, we've given them old age pensions, we've given them medical help. But in World War II, Congress knew that there were not going to be enough jobs for the 16 million veterans and for the 17 million who had worked in war plants that were now going to be closed and reconverted. So the GI Bill is written to give unemployment insurance to the veterans. Why? So they don't go on the job market. Why are they given free tuition at vocational schools or at colleges? Well, one of the reasons is to keep them off the job market for 4 or 5 years, give them new skills until the economy is reconverted. The home front, the politicians, and the soldiers, the servicemen themselves, were scared to death when they came home that they were going to return to the same depression that had been cured by the war.
One thing I found remarkable about your discussion about the GI Bill, this isn't just about going to college, not even necessarily going to vocational school. It breeds an entire generation of entertainers as well. People that you've heard of. Walter Matthau is one of them. The singer who becomes known as Tony Bennett actually goes to his early training because of the GI Bill. Tell us about the impact on the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and someone named Bernie, anybody know who Bernie Schwartz becomes? Huh? Tony Curtis, right. There are any number of these guys. Look, the GI Bill is transformative. It's one of the greatest pieces of legislation that our government has ever put together. It allows white male veterans to jump a class from working class or from lower middle class into the middle class because they go to college, they get degrees, right? And when they get out of college, they're able to use the GI Bill to buy homes, which appreciate in value so that they can send their kids to college. But for a generation of dancers, artists, actors, singers, musicians, the GI Bill gives them an education that they would never have gotten. Jazz changes
John Coltrane,
dramatically.
one of them.
John Coltrane, Dave Brubeck. They come back, Tito Puente. They come back from service. They can't find jobs as musicians, but they can go to school. And they can go to school, whether it's a vocational school or a college, they can go to school, they can get free tuition, and they can get living allowances. Now, who's teaching them in these schools? Classical musicians who had fled Germany and Eastern Europe in the 30s. So Brubeck, Coltrane, Tito Puente, a little bit less, but they learn new harmonies, new styles. Jazz is transformed. Modern dance has been transformed. A lot of the GIs come back and they want to study ballet, and they do. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, go to acting school. Ernest Borgnine can't find a job. He wants to re-enlist. His mother says, "Are you crazy?" He says, "You know, you've made people laugh all your life. Go to acting school." He tries to get into the Yale drama. And they say, "Do you have a college degree?" And he barely has a high school degree. He goes someplace else, right? And learns how to act. So it's an extraordinary story. And Norman Mailer goes to Paris to write. Robert Rauschenberg, Ellsworth Kelly, any number of artists learn their craft from the GI Bill.
Which is a remarkable part of this history that we often don't think about because we think of going to college, not necessarily training as an artist or an actor or a dancer. I'm going to ask one more question before we open up to the floor because I'm sure there's a ton of questions here. But just to give us some more numbers, 416,000 roughly Americans lose their lives in the Second World War. Another 670,000 Americans come home wounded, according to the official figures. You argue, I think very compellingly, that number is actually much higher because of the unseen wounds of what we now know as PTSD. But you write in the final pages of your book that 5 years after the war, despite the challenges that we've just talked about, the U.S. economy is booming. The divorce rate has indeed risen, but so has the marriage rate and birth rate, as you just pointed out. Crime was down. The crime actually went up right after the war, but it was down 5 years later, and the housing rate was actually up. And then I want to quote you and ask you a question. And you say, I think in the final 2 pages, quote, "The veterans fought against the trauma, pushing it back, finding ways to live their lives and move forward. They did their best to forget. They married, had children, got college degrees, bought homes, pursued careers, but the war they brought home remained with them." It's a profound quote. And my question is this. After writing 380 pages on this remarkable story, what did you conclude about the experience of this generation in the context of wider American history?
I've been asked, is the wounded generation a way of saying it wasn't the greatest generation? And my answer is absolutely not. The greatest generation was a wounded generation, and the wounded generation was the greatest generation. And why? Because these men and some women who worked for the Red Cross, for wasps and wax and donut dollies, they came back with PTSD. And they quickly realized that there was no cure. There was no treatment. Nobody knew what the hell they had. So they had to heal themselves. And how did they heal themselves? They healed themselves by plunging into school, into professional careers, into work, whether it was a union job in a factory, whether it was, as a lawyer or as a doctor. They took care of their families. They did everything they possibly could to forget the war, to distract themselves. they would, on July 4th, barricade themselves inside so they didn't hear fireworks go off. They did not watch films about the war or documentaries about the war, and they didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it to their kids, to their wives, to their friends who hadn't been in the war. They did not want to be pulled back into the war. Kurt Vonnegut, who writes Slaughterhouse-Five, comes home with PTSD, at least his children think he had. And he's able to cure himself by writing Slaughterhouse-Five and a variety of other novels. Slaughterhouse-Five, if anybody remembers it, his character, whose name I don't, the stand-in for him, his major problem, and he's in psychiatric hospital after psychiatric hospital, is time travel. Well, what's PTSD? PTSD is time travel. You can't stay in the present. At night, you have nightmares that pull you back into when you were expendable, that pull you back into your survivor's guilt, that pull you back into the situation when you know that you are not the hero, that the guys who didn't come home are the heroes, and that what saved you was luck. So it is a remarkable story. But people like my father, they live full lives. My father's life was shortened because of his heart condition, because of whatever happened in Eritrea. But one of the more distressing and enheartening parts of my research was to find out that a lot of these men who had distracted themselves for 40 years, 50 years, when they retired, when their kids grew up, and tragically when their wives died, the PTSD came back. And they didn't have the strength in their 70s and their 80s to fight it off. Fortunately, by that time, the VA had developed treatments and clinics that did not erase. Nobody ever says I was cured of PTSD, but they said I learned again to live with it. It arrived in the 80s. They went to the VA. Their children dragged them to the VA. They sat in on group therapy sessions with other veterans, and they were able to push the nightmares back again. You know, the lesson I learned from this book, or from doing the research, is, again, that wars do not end with peace treaties. That the men and women in uniform, they bring the war home with them on their bodies and their minds and their souls. And they suffer, and they endure pain that we don't understand, and they become the greatest generation because they heal themselves.
David Nasaw, thank you so much.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. I will bring the microphone over to you. Our first question will be in the front.
Dr. Nasaw, I have not had the opportunity to read your book yet, but I see that you talk about what Paris was like after the war. And I know that, you know, as Americans, we always think that everybody came home immediately, and I think your book talks about how that was not the case. Could you just let us know what Paris was like, whether or not it was the Paris of all of our dreams, or perhaps not as much?
It depends whether you were white or black, in large measure. If you were a black veteran the likelihood that was that the MPs would grab you and charge that you were AWOL. Everybody was AWOL in Paris, you know. The war, when the war ends, everybody's not shipped home. It's impossible, you know. There are still 12 million men and women in uniform. How are you going to get them all home? So there are delays. Plus, Truman and Stimson haven't figured out yet how to win the peace. You win the war, but you got to win the peace. And that means there has to be some sort of an occupation army. Well, the guys didn't want to stay. And one of the stories I tell in the book is about the mothers' clubs that form all over the country. Because the mothers of veterans and the mothers of children of veterans, you know, whose husbands are in the war, they get together all across the country. They form mothers' clubs. And they march, and they petition, and they write letters. And in one extraordinary scene that all the newspapers got, Eisenhower goes to talk about repatriation and why it's taking longer than anyone. He testifies in Congress, and he's waylaid in the halls on his way to the meeting room by a group of women. And they say, bring the boys home, bring them home right away. So he is escorted with the women following him into a congressman's office. And he tries to explain to them what's going on. And the newspapers the next day report on Eisenhower attacked by women. And, you know, a truce is called. In the end, the women who organized these mothers' clubs on their own, they succeed, I think, in pushing Truman and pushing Stimson to bring the men home faster than they want. The War Department doesn't like it. They want more men overseas until recruitment can rise and they can be replaced by young men or by a new generation of soldiers. But the outcry to bring the boys home is such that Truman and the War Department have to change their plans.
I think you quote a letter where Eisenhower, it says that essentially this lobbying effectively changed government policy.
Yeah, and Truman says it. Truman at some point has a television series in which he talks about the presidency. And in the Truman Library, they have the outtakes. This is why historians are obsessed with research. You know, we can't help ourselves. So I found the outtakes in the Truman Library, and one of the outtakes that never goes on air, he just goes, you can see him holding in his rage. He said, you know, I'm besieged by these people. They say, bring them home. He said, well, what am I going to do? We need an occupation army. We don't have the ships. He said, but nobody listens. They're all angry at me. Eisenhower is much more diplomatic. Eisenhower is amazing. Eisenhower addresses a joint session of Congress, and he explains what's going on. He says, I know you're getting letters. I know everybody's mad, and we're going to speed it up. And in the book, I talk about how the repatriation is speeded up, not because Truman and Marshall and Eisenhower and Stimson want to, but because this is a democracy and the people spoke.
Next question in the back of the room.
Thanks very much, David. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. Could you talk a little bit about the war's impact on veterans' faith? Does the war make veterans more devout, less devout? Yeah.
It's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult to figure that out. I think that for a lot of veterans, when they are overseas, there is no way to downplay, and we see it in the liberation pavilion. There's no way to downplay the role that the chaplains play. The chaplains, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, that they play, not simply in giving services, but in counseling guys, in talking to guys. And there is a sense, you know, there's this cliche, no one's an atheist in a foxhole. But what that means when we get home, we don't know. We know that there is a higher rate of church going after the war and in the 50s than there is today. And there were a lot of veterans and veterans' families in that group.
Next question toward the front.
David, do you think that movies such as Best Years of Our Lives and 12 O'Clock High help promote a better understanding of combat fatigue?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. They didn't have a chance to talk about the movies. The movies are, you know, as a historian, there's a cliche that historians use, and that the past is a foreign country. You can visit, right, but you're never entirely at home there. So as a historian, what I had to do was to sort of clear my mind of everything that had been written after, you know, 1952, 1955, really after Korea, and go back and look at the films, the newsreels, listen to the radio broadcasts, read the transcripts, the newspapers, the news magazines, the women's magazines, the glossies. And the films were extraordinary. We blast Hollywood. They all had, too many of them had Hollywood endings, except for Bataan, when everybody gets killed in the end. But the Best Years of Our Lives, has anybody seen it recently? Well, if you haven't seen it recently, watch it again. It is the great American film. And one of the reasons it's a great American film is that William Wyler, who spent the war with the Air Force, came home completely deaf in one ear and hard of hearing in the other, and was convinced he'd never work again because he was a director. Fortunately, directors work with sound men, and the sound men figured out how to the cameramen could communicate with him. And he makes this film because he knows what's going on. And the film is spot on until the end, when they have to give it a Hollywood ending. And Dana Andrews, who gets, his wife has left him. He has, I think it's Teresa Brewer, is a girlfriend. But he's lost. He thinks he's never going to get a job. And he somehow ends up on a lot where there are old planes. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. And someone says, "What are you doing in that plane?" He climbs into a plane, and somebody comes along and says, "What are you doing in that plane?" And he explains that he's a veteran, and the guy says, "Do you need a job?" And he gets a job. But I watched so many of these films, and they were incredible. Humphrey Bogart, Mitchum, Robert Ryan, they all play hard. John Garfield, they all play hard-nosed veterans who have to control their anger. They want to take revenge into their own hands on officers who had, done their troops wrong. But, watch those movies.
It's a Wonderful Life being another example of that.
Yeah, yeah. Jimmy Stewart comes back damaged, looking 20 years older than he had gone in. And Jimmy Stewart is, he's a sweetheart. He's one of the people who I wished I had a chance to talk to. He comes back after the war, and all the studios are after him to make the Jimmy Stewart movie. And he says, absolutely not. Absolutely not. He moves in with his best friend, Henry Fonda, who had also been in the war. And they move into Jane and Peter's playhouse, or he does. And the two of them spend months building model airplanes till they're ready to go back to work. But I think there's a Jimmy Stewart film being made now, without Jimmy Stewart, obviously. But he wanted to make It's a Wonderful Life, which was a total failure at the box office. Because it jumps over the war in a way that The Best Years of Our Lives, which was a huge hit, doesn't.
Your next question will stay towards the front.
I wonder, with all you've studied and learned about, massive scale PTSD, if you could project that forward and give us some idea. In the Russian-Ukraine conflict right now, you talk about expendable. The Russian troops are in a nightmare situation for them. I'm wondering, when they finish the war and they go back to Russia, even in an authoritarian regime, how do you see that playing out based on what you've learned studying this after World War II?
There's a damaged generation. I don't think that the Russians have a VA or have a program or a tradition of providing medical care and pensions for their soldiers, especially those who come home defeated or with psychological problems. The real issue for me is going to be, and it's been in the newspapers, the Israeli reservists. There have been a bunch of articles about the IDF people coming back. They're reservists. These are not professionals coming back with PTSD. And Israel is a small country, and it's got to deal with this. And nobody knows how it's going to deal with it. Nobody knows how Ukraine is going to deal with it. They'll try. I'm afraid that the Russians are going to, those people who want to serve in militias in Africa, like, I forget the name of, what was the name of the guy who was...
Oh, the Wagner Group.
Yeah,
the Wagner Group.
the Wagner Brigade. They'll always have a job. But the rest of the Russians, they're going to live miserable lives because they're not going to get the support that they require or the recognition that they require support.
Next question's in the center.
So once the veterans came home and they start to maybe readjust a little, then they see the U.S. get into another conflict in Korea and then into Vietnam. Do you think that compounded the mental stress and PTSD that now they're seeing more armed conflict, and maybe this time it's not them, but it's their children?
Yeah. The relationship, some of the guys go back. Some of the veterans who can't readjust, re-enlist for Korea. When they came out and are repatriated and are discharged, they're all asked, do you want to stay in the Army? We'll give you this and this and this. And, the vast majority laughingly say, are you serious? And the man behind the desk says, well, I'm supposed to ask you that question. But for a bunch of guys, and I can never figure out the statistics, maybe you and your researchers here can find it, of how many World War II veterans go to Korea. With Vietnam, it is this, again, we don't have a really good study. We should, of the World War II veterans and Vietnam. There are both sides to the story. One, I served my country, you go and serve your country. The other is, I serve my country, so you don't have to let somebody else fight this war. But it's a good question, and I wish I knew the answers.
We have time for one more question, and we'll be over to your right.
Yeah. Was there any difference in the percentage of soldiers coming back with PTSD between the officers who who sent these men into battle and the enlisted men and draftees that had to fight the battles.
Yeah, it's the enlisted men. It's the enlisted men who, the officers, the officers didn't have the same degree above lieutenants, moving upward, or they hid it. They also had the sense, everybody in the Army knew that you're not supposed to whine, you're not supposed to complain when you come home. But the officers had that attitude drilled into them. And there was less of a recognition that the problems they were having were serious and that they needed some sort of assistance. What's interesting, though, is that we think that it's only the men in combat in the front lines who came back with PTSD, and that's not the case. All the statistics show that the men in combat had a higher percentage of PTSD. But, everybody abroad, it wasn't, you all remember Sergeant Bilko? It wasn't Sergeant Bilko, World War II. It wasn't, okay, what's the one that's in Korea with Alda? And
No, MASH.
Yeah.
MASH.
it wasn't this. They came back, with dreadful problems that they had to solve by themselves. And they did, for the most part.
Ladies and gentlemen, Doctors David Nasaw and Bradley Hart.
Thank you.
So, back in the day as lieutenant, I was the unit censorship officer. I'm glad the unit censorship officer didn't get a hold of your book or your talk this evening. I really want to thank you, David, for being here tonight and sharing those insights. As pretty incredible. So thank you for that. I would relate, David came here years ago and former president of the American Historical Association, and was really prepared to dislike and be critical of the museum. And he admitted today that within 2 minutes, he found this a pretty incredible place. So a testimonial. I appreciate that. I had to. So three options for you. David will be the table there by the back of the Higgins boat, signing his books. If you have some of those, that'll be great. Our Veteran Services colleagues are over here by the Higgins boat and in front. I welcome you to chat with them. They're great Americans, and their services are incredible. And then for those, once you've accomplished those missions, I'd invite everyone across the street to join us at Kilroy's at the Higgins Hotel. Kilroy's will be offering extended happy hour until 9 p.m. this evening. Thanks for coming. Hope to see some of you there. But, here are these other opportunities as well. Please note, we'll have our own Veterans Day commemoration on November 11th. Then the next week, we'll have our 18th International Conference on World War II. I would say for the International Conference, tickets are nearly sold out for in-person, which is great. But we will have that live streamed online, and we'll have it available for folks afterwards too. So really, encourage folks to continue to stay involved that way. December, we have a number of programs in the first week of the month. So really check the museum events thing rather than giving you those dates right now. Just think about that. First week of December, some new opportunities here. But with that, let's give a round of applause to David Nasaw. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Bradley.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for coming this evening. Godspeed.
Thank you.